Though it's not quite summer this morning, I'm thinking of a phrase that Emerson used at the beginning of one of his great addresses. He begins it with the words, "In this refulgent summer, it is a luxury to draw the breath of life." You've had that feeling when you just feel that the whole universe is coming in with every breath, and it feels miraculous and marvelous. At last, the best days are come to West Michigan. The land seems to rejoice that it is not only free of winter, it is free to go wild with innumerable greens and profligate blooms. The peonies are so heavy they fall over onto the ground. Merriment is on every corner, being festival especially. And what is merriment but the human form of refulgence? And yet, ever and always, as my colleague pointed out earlier, amid this cheerful season, there are those who still have burdens and sorrows. And the preacher, well, this preacher at least, ever hopes and prays that he might bring a fragment of faith, hope, love, or joy to those who need them even in the most abundant of times. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be found true in thy sight, thou who art my rock and my Redeemer. It's hard to believe as I pondered this day, and I have for some weeks as I looked down the calendar and planned for the works and the words, that it was 45 years ago this week that Robert Kennedy died. I know that is not a thing we wish to think about on a blessed day in June, but we didn't want to think about it then either. It's even harder to imagine it's been longer since he died than he actually lived. Those of us who were at least mostly grown in that year might count that as the moment when our blithe hope in America could no longer survive. Just 6 weeks earlier, Dr. King had died. It was 1968, a year no one wants to repeat. I think every generation, though, has its moment of dashed innocence when we realize that summer is not endless. For some folks, perhaps not one in this room, but nearly so, back in 1920, shoeless Joe Jackson and 7 Chicago White Sox were on trial for throwing the World Series. They were acquitted, but legend has it that when they left the courthouse, a young boy looked up at Joe and said, "Say it ain't so, Joe," and it became a motto for a generation. Of course, in 1939, when Adolf Hitler invaded Poland, that was less than a year after Neville Chamberlain proclaimed that we had peace in our time. Another generation dashed. And then the one I want to land on mostly today was 1954, and on this exact day, Senator Joseph McCarthy, according to the U.S. Senate history site, says, picked a fight with the United States Army charging lax security at a top secret Army facility. He in essence said that they had communists. The Army had to hire its own lawyer, Joseph Welch, to make its case. And on June 9th, 1954, McCarthy charged that one of Welch's attorneys had ties to a communist organization. The website continues, as an amazed television audience looked on, Welch responded with the immortal lines that ultimately ended McCarthy's career. "Until this moment, Senator," he said, "I think I never really gauged your cruelty and recklessness." When McCarthy tried to continue the attack, Welch angrily interrupted, saying, "Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You have done enough. Have you no sense of decency?" It's hard to believe that only 14 years later, at Robert Kennedy's funeral, how much happened in 14 years. Edward Kennedy, known as Ted, concluded his memorable eulogy with these words, "My brother need not be idolized or enlarged in death beyond what he was in life. to be remembered simply as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, saw war and tried to stop it. Is there a better definition of decency on the planet? I think not. But we use decency so little now that it kind of lost its magnitude. When we encounter decency now, it's mostly in the newspaper of someone being charged with indecent exposure. It seems rather modest or immodest, as the case may be, a small virtue, hardly worth celebrating. But when Joe Welch responded to Senator McCarthy, it gained the gravitas it really deserves. He was saying to the senator, "You have lost your humanity." Welch said that McCarthy was inhuman. To be indecent is to be inhuman. To be decent is to be human at its best, to treat yourself in that golden rule sense. Of course, though, the problem with decency is that it doesn't sell. It's really hard to be interested in a movie or a television show or even a book about decency. Fame and fortune are the coin of value. When was the last time you bought a book about an ordinary person who did good deeds? I think not, but how many biographies of the rich and famous fly off the shelves? We all know the most rich man in the world, that would be Bill Gates, but the most decent goes unknown. We all know that A-Rod is the richest baseball player, but we have no clue who is the nicest T-ball coach. Vladimir Putin is getting divorced, we all know that, but the gentle marriages of those who are being decent are hardly remarked on in the newspapers. Money and power have ever consorted, which explains one fact that I find dismaying. We are a fortunate country. We have a country in which over 7% of American citizens are millionaires. It's just magnificent. Did you know that in Congress the percentage of millionaires is 47%? And we wonder why money and power seem to live so closely. One of my favorite writers is the misanthropic H.L. Mencken, who once observed, "It is inaccurate to say that I hate everything. I am strongly in favor of common sense, common honesty, and common decency, which makes me forever ineligible for public office." No, decency does not sell, but it does pay. For proof, I look to wiser folk than me. This wonderful passage from George Orwell that I found in digging through the refuse of books. He was no optimist, if you know him, but he said this wonderful thing, commenting on ordinary people. He observed that the small clerks, shop assistants, commercial travelers, insurance touts, and tram conductors, did they know that they were only puppets dancing when money pulled the strings? You bet they didn't. And if they did, what would they care? They were too busy being born, being married, begetting, working, dying. Our civilization is founded on greed and fear, but in the lives of common men, the greed and fear are mysteriously transmuted into something nobler. The lower middle class people in there behind their lace curtains with their children and their scraps of furniture and their aspidistras contrive to keep their decency. Decency redeems money and power, perhaps. And that is maybe what inspired Robert Kennedy himself when he was in South Africa, before he died, obviously. He said to them there, during the apartheid era, "Few will have the greatness to bend history, but each of us can work to change a small portion of the events. And then the total, all of these acts will be written in the history of this generation. It is from numberless, diverse acts of courage and belief that human history is shaped. Each time someone stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, it sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance." What a splendid sentence that is to read. No one talks like that anymore, and more the pity. If Orwell and Kennedy are right about the inequitable distribution of power and money, decency is what ordinary people have, and it sounds like small change. What a shame it is so often diluted by religion into keeping your nose clean, as it were, a sort of individualized Puritanism that talks about avoiding sin, covering the skin, and blending in, all until we get to heaven. Decency reduced to some sort of spiritual hygiene. Listen to me fulminate on such a refulgent day. Emerson's observation, though, came at the beginning of a speech in which he dismissed the Unitarianism of his day as a corpse-cold religion. He was not invited back for 30 years. But in that speech, he recommended a renewal of his Unitarian faith, which was only 20 years old at the time. And his answer was this: soul, soul, and evermore soul, to give it life. If we want decency to be the power that sucks the power out of fame and fortune and money, it must have a spiritual revolution of soul, soul, and evermore soul. It must become a deliberate and spiritual and moral and political act that deliberately subverts our fealty to those in power and returns it to the masses with their lace curtains and their aspidistras. We must make decency noble again. But how?